I must have been around 11 years old at the time. By then, it was just my sister, Sarah, and me living at home. Our father worked the night shift frequently, leaving us alone in the house more often than we liked. The quiet isolation of those nights felt heavier than usual, especially this one particular evening. It was late, maybe an hour after we'd gone to bed. The darkness in the house felt oppressive, as if it had weight and texture. Suddenly, I was startled awake by an unsettling sound. It wasn't subtle. It was loud and distinct, like someone rummaging through crumpled Christmas wrapping paper or aggressively tearing plastic, maybe even tinfoil. The sound echoed with an eerie deliberateness that made my skin crawl. For a moment, I lay frozen in my bed, every nerve on edge. My heart pounded as I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination. But the noise continued, relentless and invasive, as though someone was searching for something with single-minded determination. Then I heard Sarah's voice pierce through the tension from her room across the hall. "Stop it!" she shouted, her tone sharp and angry. I knew my sister well, and the anger in her voice wasn't from annoyance. It was fear masquerading as frustration. She thought it was me. Her accusation sent a shiver through me. Gathering what little courage I had, I called back, "That's not me!" My voice wavered slightly, betraying the flood of fear and confusion overtaking me. The moment the words left my mouth, I felt a chilling realization wash over me. I knew Sarah's anger wasn't just from the noise. It was because the sound had shaken her, too. For a fleeting second, I wanted to believe she was playing some cruel trick on me. But the way her voice quivered ever so slightly as she called out my name made it clear, she wasn't faking anything. As soon as I replied, the noise stopped, as if whoever, or whatever, had been making it knew we were aware. The oppressive silence that followed was almost worse. My sister and I didn't dare leave our rooms or speak further. We stayed locked in our respective prisons of fear, the night stretching on endlessly. Though we didn't talk about it much afterward, the incident stayed with me. For weeks, I couldn't bring myself to sleep alone. I'd creep into Sarah's room, pleading to stay with her. She never argued. I think she needed the comfort as much as I did, even if she wouldn't admit it. But that wasn't the only unsettling experience Sarah had around that time. She told me about another incident, one that made her voice drop to a whisper when she recounted it. She'd been sitting alone in the living room, engrossed in a book, while I was outside playing. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where the house seemed almost alive with its creaks and groans. Then, out of nowhere, she heard tapping. It started faintly, like the rhythmic knock of fingers on a wall. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, but the tapping grew louder and more deliberate. Every time she looked up to pinpoint the source, the sound stopped abruptly. It was as if someone was watching her, toying with her nerves. She said it felt like an unseen presence was just out of sight, reveling in her unease. That story unnerved me more than I cared to admit. Looking back, those events feel like fragments of a bad dream, disjointed and surreal. But they happened, and the fear they instilled was all too real. Even now, the memory of that night and the tapping sound linger in the recesses of my mind, whispering reminders of a time when the darkness felt alive. After that, Sarah and I grew more cautious, or maybe paranoid. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, felt magnified. The house seemed alive, breathing its eerie whispers into the shadows. We started sleeping with our bedroom doors open, our rooms connected by an unspoken agreement to keep each other within earshot. One night, about a week after the first incident, something else happened. It began innocently enough. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, too anxious to sleep. The faint glow of the streetlight outside cast strange, jagged shadows through the gaps in my curtains. I remember listening intently to the silence, straining to catch any noise that didn't belong. My nerves were so taut that when Sarah's voice called out, it felt like a jolt of electricity ran through me. "Are you awake?" she whispered from across the hall. "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely audible. "What is it? Do you hear that?" I froze, my heart pounding. "Hear what?" She didn't answer immediately, and that silence was worse than any sound. Then, finally, she said, "Listen by the window." Reluctantly, I slid out of bed, my feet touching the cold hardwood floor. Every step toward the window felt like a journey into the unknown. I pulled the curtain aside just enough to peer out, my breath fogging the glass. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just the quiet, empty street illuminated by the weak orange glow of the street lamp. But then I heard it. A faint scratching sound. It was almost imperceptible, like nails dragging lightly against wood. My stomach churned as I tried to rationalize it. A branch, maybe? An animal? But the sound wasn't random. It came in deliberate intervals, each stroke slow and purposeful. It was coming from the window frame itself. "Do you hear it?" Sarah asked again, her voice trembling now. "Yeah," I whispered back. "Stay in your room." I couldn't explain why I said it, as if I had the authority to protect her. My own fear was a tidal wave, threatening to pull me under. But some part of me felt compelled to act, to confront whatever it was. Gathering what courage I could muster, I reached for the window latch. My hand trembled as I slid it open, inch by inch, the cold night air rushing in and prickling my skin. The scratching stopped instantly. I leaned out cautiously, scanning the darkness below. Nothing. No signs of movement. Just the stillness of the night mocking me. I pulled back inside and closed the window, locking it with a trembling hand. "There's nothing there," I called out, more for my own reassurance than Sarah's. "Then what was it?" she asked, her voice muffled but insistent. "I don't know," I admitted. And that was the truth. I didn't know, and the not knowing was worse than any explanation my mind could conjure. The following morning, we inspected the area outside the window. There were no branches near enough to cause the sound, and the ground beneath the frame was undisturbed. No footprints, no signs of animals. It was as if the night itself had conspired to torment us. After that, the atmosphere in the house shifted. It wasn't just the nights that felt oppressive anymore. Even during the day, there was an inexplicable tension in the air. Sarah stopped reading in the living room. I avoided looking out the windows. We moved through the house like intruders, as though we didn't belong there. And then came the night that changed everything. I woke to a sound I'd never forget. It wasn't scratching or tapping this time. It was a voice. Low, guttural, and impossibly close. It whispered my name. "Ethan." Every hair on my body stood on end as I shot upright in bed. My breath came in shallow gasps as I scanned the room, my eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. The voice didn't come again, but I could still feel its presence, lingering like a phantom in the air. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was a nightmare. But deep down, I knew better. That voice was real. And it knew my name. After that night, the whispers became more frequent. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of leaves in a distant breeze. But over time, they grew bolder, louder. They never spoke words I could understand, save for the occasional repetition of my name. "Ethan," uttered with a chilling familiarity that turned my blood cold. Sarah was the first to suggest leaving. "Something isn't right here," she said one morning over breakfast. Her hands shook as she held her coffee mug, and dark circles rimmed her eyes from countless sleepless nights. "We need to tell Dad. We can't stay here anymore." I wanted to agree with her, but a part of me resisted. Not because I doubted her. I felt the same unease, the same heavy presence that seemed to watch us constantly. But something about the house seemed to hold me in its grip, like it didn't want me to leave. We finally brought it up to our father one evening when he was home between shifts. Sarah did most of the talking, recounting the strange sounds, the whispers, and the oppressive atmosphere. I could tell he was skeptical, but he didn't dismiss us outright. "You're probably just imagining things," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Old houses make noise. It's nothing to be afraid of." "It's not just the house," Sarah insisted. "There's something here. Something wrong." Dad sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, I'll check the place out tomorrow." Maybe there's a loose vent or a rodent in the walls. That's all it is. But the next night, something happened that even Dad couldn't explain. It was late, past midnight. Sarah and I were in our rooms, pretending to sleep, when a loud crash shattered the silence. It sounded like something heavy had fallen in the kitchen. I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing. From across the hall, I heard Sarah gasp. Dad was the first to investigate. He stormed out of his room, flashlight in hand, and made his way downstairs. Sarah and I hesitated before following, sticking close together as we descended the creaking stairs. When we reached the kitchen, the sight that greeted us was inexplicable. Every cabinet door was wide open, their contents strewn across the floor. Plates, glasses, pots, and pans lay in shattered heaps, as if they'd been thrown with violent force. The refrigerator door hung ajar, its light casting a sickly glow on the chaos. Dad stood frozen in the doorway, his flashlight beam trembling as it swept over the wreckage. "What the hell happened here?" he muttered. "I told you," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not just the house." We spent the rest of the night cleaning up the mess, but the sense of unease only grew. Dad didn't say much after that, but I could tell he was rattled. The next morning, he took Sarah and me aside. "I'm going to have someone come take a look at the place," he said. "In the meantime, stick together and don't go wandering around at night. If anything else happens, wake me up immediately." Despite his attempts to reassure us, the house only grew more oppressive in the days that followed. The whispers became more frequent, their tone mocking and cruel. Shadows seemed to move on their own, darting just out of sight. And then there were the dreams, or were they dreams? I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find myself standing at the edge of the staircase, staring down into the inky blackness below. I'd have no memory of getting out of bed, and the sensation of being watched was so overwhelming that I'd sprint back to my room, trembling. Sarah began experiencing the same thing. One morning, she told me she'd woken up to find herself in the living room, standing in front of the fireplace. "I don't know how I got there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's like something's pulling us, guiding us." Neither of us could deny it anymore. Whatever was in the house didn't just want to scare us. It wanted us. The final night in that house began like any other. The oppressive air seemed heavier than usual, the walls radiating a silence so profound it felt alive. Sarah and I huddled in her room, too frightened to sleep alone. Dad had left for work, his reassurances ringing hollow after everything that had happened. We had locked all the doors, drawn the curtains, and left every light in the house blazing. None of it made us feel safer. Around midnight, the whispers began again. They weren't subtle this time, they echoed through the house, coming from every direction at once. Sarah clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin as we sat frozen on her bed. "Ethan!" they hissed, louder and more insistent. "Sarah!" Hearing her name spoken by that voice sent her into a silent sob. "We can't stay here," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We need to leave." "Now." She nodded, her eyes wide with terror. We crept out of her room, holding hands like children. The hallway stretched before us, its shadows seeming to pulse and writhe despite the overhead light. Every step felt like a betrayal of the silence, our breathing shallow and quick. As we reached the staircase, the air grew colder, each breath visible in the dim glow. That's when we saw it. A figure stood at the base of the stairs, shrouded in darkness. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its form flickered, as if it were struggling to exist in our world. Its face was indistinct, but its eyes, those eyes burned with an unnatural light, piercing and cruel. "You can't leave," it said, its voice a guttural snarl that resonated deep within my chest. The words weren't loud, but they filled the space, leaving no room for anything else. Sarah let out a strangled scream, and I felt her grip on my hand tighten. My body moved before my mind could catch up, pulling her back toward her room. The figure didn't move, but the air around us seemed to thicken, each step harder than the last. It was as if the house itself was trying to hold us in place. We slammed the door shut and pushed her dresser against it, our frantic movements driven by sheer panic. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by a rhythmic pounding on the walls. "Ethan!" the voice called again, closer this time. "Sarah!" I grabbed the baseball bat Dad kept in her closet and positioned myself near the door. My hands shook so violently I could barely hold it steady. Sarah crouched in the corner, tears streaming down her face as she whispered prayers under her breath. Then silence. The pounding stopped, the whispers ceased, and the air became unnervingly still. I strained my ears, every muscle in my body tense. The quiet was worse than the noise. It was the kind of silence that promised something worse was coming. And then, the door burst open. The dresser slid across the floor as if it weighed nothing, crashing into the wall with a deafening thud. The figure stood in the doorway, its shape more defined now, its presence overwhelming. I swung the bat with all my strength, but it passed through the figure, as though it were made of smoke. The momentum sent me stumbling forward, and I felt an icy grip close around my wrist. Time seemed to slow. My vision blurred, and a wave of darkness washed over me, filled with whispers and images I couldn't comprehend. A sense of despair unlike anything I'd ever known consumed me. But then, a voice broke through the fog, not the entity's voice, but Sarah's. "Leave us alone!" she screamed, her voice raw with fear and fury. She held up the crucifix she'd grabbed from her nightstand, its small gold form gleaming in the dim light. The figure recoiled, its shape dissolving into a swirling mass of shadows that retreated into the hallway. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air became breathable again. We didn't wait to see if it would return. Grabbing only our phones and the clothes on our backs, we ran. Out of her room, down the stairs, through the front door, and into the night. The cold air bit at our skin, but it was a relief after the suffocating atmosphere of the house. We didn't stop running until we reached the neighbor's house. They must have seen the terror on our faces because they didn't ask questions, just let us in and called Dad. He came home immediately, his face a mix of anger and concern as he listened to our frantic recounting of the night. We never went back to that house. Dad sold it within a month, and we moved into a small apartment across town. Life slowly returned to normal, but Sarah and I were never quite the same. The memories lingered, the shadows of that house etched permanently into our minds. To this day, I don't know what it was that haunted us. A ghost, a demon, or something beyond human understanding. But I do know this, it wasn't just a house. It was alive, and it wanted us. And I pray every night that it never finds us again.